More than a century after the murders in 1888, a modern DNA test has brought investigators closer than ever to identifying the man behind the crimes. Evidence once ignored is now being re-examined, and what it reveals is shifting this case from speculation towards something far more defined and measurable. The DNA breakthrough that changed everything. A preserved piece of fabric linked to one of the victims was re-examined using modern forensic methods in 2019, marking a major shift in the investigation. The item, believed to be connected to Catherine Eddowes, had been stored privately for decades before being tested with updated DNA extraction techniques. Scientists focused on mitochondrial DNA, which can survive longer than other genetic material and allows tracing through maternal lineage. Now, this is where it becomes important. The DNA recovered from the fabric was compared with living descendants connected to a long-standing suspect. This matters because earlier investigations lacked the tools to confirm identity through biological evidence. During the original case in 1888, police in Whitechapel relied on witness accounts and circumstantial clues, none of which led to a definitive conclusion. That distinction is important. The introduction of DNA analysis changes the nature of the evidence from interpretive to biological. The results indicated a match with descendants of Aaron Kosminski, a suspect identified during the original investigation but never charged. The comparison process involved tracing maternal lines across generations, linking modern individuals back to the historical figure. This connection does not rely on assumptions or testimonies, but on measurable genetic markers. The testing process was repeated to confirm accuracy, using separate samples and controlled conditions. Each result pointed in the same direction, strengthening the reliability of the findings. The identification of a suspect through DNA represents a turning point, shifting the case from an unresolved mystery toward a scientifically supported conclusion. The crime scene that was never solved. The events that defined the case began in 1888 in the district of Whitechapel, an area of London known at the time for overcrowding and poverty. Within a span of a few months, a series of murders took place under similar conditions, targeting women in isolated areas during the late hours of the night. The locations were narrow alleyways and poorly lit streets, making surveillance and response difficult for authorities. Now, this is where it becomes important. The nature of the injuries suggested a level of anatomical knowledge, as the attacks were carried out with speed and precision. This matters because it influenced how investigators viewed potential suspects, focusing on individuals with some understanding of human anatomy. However, without forensic tools, these assessments remained speculative. Police efforts during the time were limited by the absence of fingerprinting and DNA analysis. Officers conducted interviews, followed leads, and detained several individuals, but none could be definitively linked to the crimes. That distinction is important. The investigation relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, which often conflicted or lacked detail. Records from Scotland Yard show that multiple suspects were considered, including individuals living within close proximity to the crime scenes. Despite this, no charges were filed that could be sustained in court. The sequence of events ended as suddenly as it began, with no further confirmed incidents after that year. The case remained unresolved for over a century, becoming one of the most studied investigations in criminal history, defined by its lack of closure and absence of conclusive evidence. The victim that held the key. The breakthrough in the investigation centers around Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims identified during the events of 1888 in Whitechapel. At the time, evidence collection methods were limited, and many items from the scene were either lost or never formally recorded. Among these was a shawl believed to have been found near the body. This item was not processed through official channels and was instead taken into private possession, where it remained for decades without formal verification. Now, this is where it becomes important. The shawl was largely dismissed by investigators and historians for over a century because its origin could not be confirmed through documented records. This matters because without a clear chain of custody, physical evidence is typically considered unreliable. That distinction is important. It meant that even if the item was authentic, it could not be used within traditional investigative frameworks at the time. In recent years, advances in forensic science changed how such materials could be examined. Around 2019, the fabric was subjected to modern DNA testing methods, focusing on biological traces that had remained embedded within the material. These tests aim to identify both victim and potential suspect DNA through mitochondrial analysis, which is more resilient over long periods. The results linked the biological material on the shawl directly to Eddowes and provided a connection to a suspect through genetic comparison. This shifted the status of the shawl from a dismissed artifact to a central piece of evidence. The item, once ignored due to uncertainty, became a bridge between historical events and modern scientific validation, allowing investigators to re-examine the case with a new form of evidence that did not exist during the original investigation. The suspect hidden in plain sight. The DNA findings pointed toward Aaron Kosminski, a figure who had already appeared in police records during the original investigation in 1888. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant living in London, specifically within the Whitechapel area where the crimes occurred. At the time, he was considered a person of interest by investigators, but was never formally charged due to a lack of concrete evidence. Now this is where it becomes important. Historical records describe Kosminski as someone with documented mental health issues, including periods of instability that led to his eventual placement in an institution. This matters because his profile matched some of the behavioral patterns investigators were trying to identify, particularly the ability to move through the area without drawing attention. That distinction is important. His proximity to the crime scenes and his presence within the community placed him within the range of suspicion, even without direct proof. Despite being identified as a suspect, authorities at the time could not establish a case strong enough for prosecution. The absence of forensic tools meant there was no way to connect him physically to the crimes. Records from Scotland Yard indicate that, while he was monitored, he was ultimately released from suspicion due to insufficient evidence. The recent DNA analysis has brought renewed attention to his role in the case. By linking biological material to his lineage, the investigation now includes a form of evidence that was not available to original investigators. The focus has shifted from circumstantial suspicion to measurable data, placing Kosminski back at the center of a case that remained unresolved for over a century. The DNA evidence explained. The identification process relied on mitochondrial DNA, a form of genetic material that can survive for long periods and is passed down through maternal lines. Testing, conducted around 2019, focused on extracting this type of DNA from the preserved shawl linked to Catherine Eddowes. Unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA remains more stable over time, making it suitable for analyzing historical evidence. Now, this is where it becomes important. This method allows scientists to trace lineage across generations, connecting modern individuals to historical figures through direct maternal ancestry. This matters because the extracted DNA was compared with living relatives connected to both the victim and the suspect. By matching sequences, researchers were able to establish a genetic link between the biological material found on the shawl and descendants of Aaron Kosminski. That distinction is important. It transforms the evidence from circumstantial association into biological correlation, providing a measurable connection that was not possible during the original investigation in 1888. The process involved multiple stages of verification, including repeated testing and comparison across separate samples to ensure consistency. The results showed a strong alignment between the genetic markers, indicating that the DNA belonged to individuals connected through the same maternal line. This does not rely on interpretation or witness accounts, but on identifiable genetic patterns. The introduction of this type of analysis represents the first time biological evidence has been used to connect a suspect directly to the case, shifting the investigation from historical reconstruction towards scientific identification. The problems with the evidence. Despite the significance of the DNA findings, several issues remain unresolved regarding the reliability of the evidence. The shawl itself has a disputed history, with no official documentation confirming it was collected during the events in 1888 in Whitechapel. Now, This is where it becomes important. Without a verified chain of custody, it is difficult to confirm whether the item remained uncontaminated over time. This matters because the shawl was handled and stored privately for over 100 years, increasing the possibility that external DNA could have been introduced. That distinction is important. Even minimal contamination can affect results, especially when dealing with historical samples where the original material is limited. Critics within the scientific community have also pointed out that mitochondrial DNA, while useful for tracing lineage, cannot uniquely identify an individual. It can confirm a connection to a family line, but not distinguish between different members of that line with complete certainty. This limitation affects how the results are interpreted. In reviews conducted after 2019, some researchers argued that the findings should be treated with caution until additional evidence can support the conclusions. The debate continues among forensic experts, with some accepting the results as a significant step forward, while others maintain that the evidence does not meet the standard required for a definitive identification. The pattern of the killer revealed. The sequence of murders recorded in 1888 across Whitechapel followed a pattern that investigators began to recognize as the case developed. The victims were primarily women living in vulnerable conditions, often working late hours in isolated parts of London. The locations were consistent: narrow streets, dimly lit alleys, and areas with limited visibility. Now, this is where it becomes important. The selection of victims and locations suggests a level of familiarity with the area, indicating that the individual responsible understood both the environment and the routines of those living within it. This matters because the nature of the injuries showed increasing precision over time. Early reports from Scotland Yard noted that the attacks were carried out quickly, with little evidence of struggle, suggesting control and planning. That distinction is important. The progression in method indicates that the individual may have been gaining confidence or refining their approach with each incident. Medical observations at the time pointed to the removal of organs in a manner that suggested some level of anatomical knowledge. While the exact level of expertise remains debated, the consistency of these actions across multiple cases indicates that they were not random. This aligns with the theory that the individual had experience or exposure to anatomy, whether through profession or repeated practice. The timing of the attacks also followed a pattern, typically occurring during late-night hours when streets were less active. This reduced the likelihood of interruption and allowed the individual to move without drawing attention. Combined with the choice of location, this suggests an awareness of both timing and movement within the area. The pattern that emerges is not only about the acts themselves, but about how they were carried out. The consistency across multiple incidents indicates planning, familiarity with the surroundings, and an understanding of human vulnerability within that specific environment. Why he was never caught. The investigation into the events of 1888 was limited by the tools and methods available at the time, which significantly affected the ability of authorities to identify a suspect. In London, police relied heavily on witness accounts, physical observation, and basic record keeping. Now this is where it becomes important. Without access to forensic techniques such as DNA analysis or fingerprinting, there was no reliable way to connect a suspect directly to the crimes. This matters because even when individuals were detained, there was no physical evidence to support charges. Reports from Scotland Yard indicate that multiple suspects were questioned and, in some cases, held temporarily, but all were released due to insufficient proof. That distinction is important. Suspicion alone was not enough to proceed with legal action, especially in cases where witness statements conflicted or lacked detail. Witness reports themselves presented challenges. Many accounts were inconsistent, with different descriptions of the same individual, making it difficult to establish a clear suspect profile. The conditions in Whitechapel, including poor lighting and crowded living spaces, further reduced the reliability of these observations. Coordination between different police divisions was also limited. Communication systems in the 19th century were not designed for rapid information sharing, which slowed the investigation and created gaps in tracking movements across different areas. As a result, the investigation lacked the tools, consistency, and coordination needed to identify and prosecute a suspect. The combination of these limitations allowed the individual responsible to remain unidentified, despite multiple investigations and continued attention from authorities. The impact of the revelation. The introduction of DNA evidence into a case that began in 1888 has significantly altered how it is viewed today. For over a century, the investigation remained unresolved, built on witness reports, fragmented records, and competing theories. Now, this is where it becomes important. The use of modern forensic analysis has shifted the focus away from speculation toward measurable data, bringing a level of clarity that was never previously possible. This matters because the identification of a potential suspect through scientific testing challenges long-standing assumptions that the case could never be resolved. In London, the events in Whitechapel had become a historical mystery, studied more for its unanswered questions than for any confirmed conclusions. That distinction is important. The introduction of biological evidence transforms the case from an open-ended narrative into an investigation that can be reassessed using modern standards. The findings have also raised questions about how historical evidence is preserved and evaluated. Items once considered insignificant or unreliable are now being re-examined with updated methods. This reflects a broader shift in how older cases are approached, where advances in technology allow for new forms of analysis that were not available at the time. In reviews conducted after 2019, researchers began comparing this case to other historical investigations where modern science has been applied to unresolved events. The results demonstrate that long-standing cases are not necessarily closed, but may remain incomplete due to limitations in earlier methods. The impact extends beyond identifying a suspect. It changes how investigators approach historical cases, emphasizing the role of preserved evidence and the potential for future analysis to provide new insights. The truth that still isn't settled. Despite the DNA findings pointing toward Aaron Kosminski, the case is not considered fully resolved within the scientific and historical communities. The evidence provides a strong indication, but it does not meet the standard required for universal acceptance. Now, this is where it becomes important. The limitations of mitochondrial DNA mean that while it can confirm a familial link, it cannot uniquely identify a single individual among all members of that lineage. This matters because the conclusions drawn from the testing remain subject to interpretation. In discussions following 2019, researchers and historians have continued to examine both the strengths and weaknesses of the evidence. That distinction is important. The case now exists in a space between identification and uncertainty, where scientific findings suggest a direction but do not fully close the investigation. There is also the possibility that future advancements in forensic technology could provide more precise analysis. Techniques that are still developing may allow for clearer differentiation between individuals within the same genetic line. This keeps the case open to further refinement rather than final closure. In academic circles across London, debate continues regarding how the evidence should be classified, whether as a definitive identification or as a significant but incomplete finding. The discussion reflects the broader challenge of applying modern science to historical material that has limitations in origin and preservation. The identity of the individual responsible may be closer than at any point since 1888, but it remains a conclusion that is still being examined, tested, and debated. The case that began in 1888 in Whitechapel has never fully disappeared from historical focus, but the introduction of DNA analysis has changed how it is understood. Evidence once considered uncertain is now being examined with modern tools, allowing connections to be made that were not possible before. This matters because the investigation is no longer limited to written records or witness accounts. In London, researchers continue to study both the original case files and the results produced after 2019, comparing historical context with scientific data. That distinction is important. It shows that the case now exists at the intersection of history and forensic science, rather than in speculation alone. The identification of Aaron Kosminski adds a defined direction to the investigation, even as discussions continue around the strength of the evidence. What remains clear is that the case has moved forward, shaped by methods that did not exist at the time, and continues to be examined with the expectation that further clarity may still emerge.